This is Chapter 2, Learning Objective 1, talking about the Fair Labor Standards Act. Enterprise coverage, meaning like for a company, includes all the employees if two or more work in interstate commerce and they have $500,000 or more in gross sales or produce goods for interstate commerce. Plus there's nonprofit schools regardless of annual sales volume. Or there could be individual employees that are covered if the employee is at a company that doesn't meet the enterprise coverage, but they're in a fringe occupation. For example, they drive for a fleet that transports goods. They have annual revenues equal to $225,000. Then the individual employee would be covered by that. Federal wage and hour law provides for both of these types of coverages, and many family businesses are exempt. With regards to the health care plan, those companies that are subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act are also subject to the Health Care Plan Act. Otherwise, they're not. If they're not covered under Fair Labor, the FLSA, then they don't have to abide by the health care plan for companies. The employee and employer might seem really straightforward, the definition, but like everything, they've got to be really specific because there's lots of gray areas. So an employer is an individual who acts directly or indirectly in the interest of an employer in relation to an employee. So if you're in that relationship, then you would be considered an employer. And an individual is an employee if he or she performs services in a covered employment. It could be a common law relationship, but the IRS also has a test based on, can the employer tell the employee what to do? Is there financial control, like who's paying, who's in charge of determining the wage, and just the general relationship between the two parties. And there are specific rules that apply to employees of corporations, domestic employees, partners in partnerships, and statutory employees. The independent contractor is defined by the ABC test, and that's what somebody would be if they're not an employee, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. So domestic help, nannies, gardeners, chauffeurs, they're also considered employees. However, casual babysitter and people that are watching aging people, like your elderly parents that are in the home with you or something along those lines, they're not covered. These employees have to earn minimum wage plus overtime if they work 8 hours a week or more, or they earn at least $1,000 in a calendar year. Live-in domestics, like a live-in nanny, don't have to be paid overtime. So what is the minimum wage? What's included in that? It includes all rates of pay, including, but not limited to, any commissions, non-discretionary bonuses, and severance pay, which non-discretionary just means it's built in. It's not up to the discretion, or it's not up to the employer to just say, yeah, I think we'll do it this time and not next time. It means it's by the agreement between the employer and the employee. Severance pay is what somebody gets when they quit a job, and it also includes on-call or differential pay. So discretionary bonus, basically it's not been agreed on beforehand or promised beforehand. So if that's the case, it's not included in the regular rate of pay, meaning you don't include it to determine if they're making a minimum wage or not. Other types of compensation that you don't include when you're figuring if they're hitting the minimum wage: any gifts made as a reward for service, payments in a profit sharing plan, vacation, holiday, sick day, or jury duty pay, vehicle, tool, or uniform allowances. Those don't get counted in towards the minimum wage. So what's the difference between a minimum wage and a living wage? The current minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. And there is a proposal to increase this wage rate. At this point, it's up to $9.80 at the time that I'm recording this. And a side note, if the minimum wage had kept pace with inflation over the past 40 years, it would be up to $10.24. But instead, it's at $7.25. There are certain exceptions to minimum wages. A living wage, and your book goes into that. A living wage refers to local ordinances that vary between cities. And there's been a movement by cities to say, we need to pay our people enough so that they can actually live on their salary and they're not on government assistance. And so depending on where that city is and the cost of living, the living wages differ. At this recording, Utah does not have a living wage law, though there's a lot of private industries that are paying, or companies that are paying a living wage. So, tipped employees. Lots of us have been had jobs where we depend on tips. So, do we include those tips towards the minimum wage or not? Depends. A tipped employee is, by definition, one who regularly averages more than $30 a month in tips. And the minimum tipped wages, if somebody's a tipped employee, the minimum you can pay them as an employer is $2.13 an hour. So the tip credit, which is the difference between a minimum wage and what they're actually getting paid, is $5.12 an hour. And the basic assumption is that they're going to make at least $5.12 an hour in tips. And if they do, then they're being paid the minimum wage when that is added to the $2.13. The tip credit remains the same even when you're calculating overtime pay. So if your overtime pay is more than $7.25 an hour, the tip credit is still the same, and the difference is going to have to come up. The minimum wage is going to have to come up. Not the minimum wage, but what you're going to pay them for wages. So here's an example of tips received for a 40-hour work week. A 40-hour work week times $2.13 would be regular wages of $85.20. So case number one. An employee reports tips of $43. So you take the $85.20, which is the wage that they're getting paid, plus their $43, and it is not less than, it's not greater than $2.90. Now the $2.90 is 40 hours times the minimum wage. So in this case, their tips added to their wage does not equal the minimum wage, so the employer is going to have to pay additional wages of $247. You take the $2.90 minus the 43, and it equals $247, and that's what they're going to have to pay. So here's a second scenario. You've got your tips reported $11.89. So you've got your $85.20, which is the wage that they're being paid, plus their tips. Yes, it's greater than $2.90. So the employer is fine just to pay the $85.20. States' tip credit percentages might differ from the federal law, particularly if they have a different minimum wage. So, overtime provisions and exceptions. The work week is established by corporate policy, and it has to be 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. This is the definition of a work week. For example, 12:01 a.m. Saturday to 11:59 p.m. Friday. Some states require daily overtime over 8 hours, and if the state plan is more generous than the Fair Labor and Standards Act, then the state law is followed. So they're not calculating it on weekly basis, weekly basis. It's on a daily basis. The FSLA says overtime pay has to be 1.5 times the regular pay. Employer can require employees to work overtime. Now there are exceptions to the above details that we've given you. If you're a hospital employee, the overtime can be calculated based on a 2-hour time or 2-week time span. So if you work more than 80 plus hours in 14 days, or over 8 hours in a day, whichever is greatest, then you'd be getting overtime. Retail or service industry employees that are earning commissions, the overtime is subject to different rules. And employees receiving remedial education aren't subject to the overtime. So when your employees take time off, how do you work with that? Comp time is what is commonly referred to. And what that is it's instead of paying them overtime, you say, okay, we'll give you some, you can take time off later on. So an employee in public safety or emergency response can accumulate it up to 320 hours. So they would work 320 hours overtime, times it by 1.45. They can accrue up to 480 hours of comp time. And the employee whose work doesn't include activities from exception in here, so if you're not an employee in public safety or emergency response, then you can accumulate up to 240 hours. So you can work 160 hours of overtime and get 240 hours of comp time. And the employee has to be paid out in cash for their comp time that hasn't been used up when their employment is terminated. So an exempt employee means they're exempt from some or all of the FLSA provisions. So white-collar workers that are outlined in the text, they're exempt. And I'm going to let you read those. I'm not going to read them out loud. It's not, unless I have something to add to it, I'm not going to. Now the test of exemption means that the employee has to meet the primary duty requirements listed in the text in figure 2.2. And rather than me going through that, I say just look at this figure to determine what those primary duty requirements are. The employee has to be paid on a salary basis of at least $455 a week. But blue-collar workers are always entitled to overtime pay. And that would include police officers, EMTs, firefighters, paramedics, and licensed practical nurses. Putting somebody on a salary doesn't automatically mean that they're exempt. So, Equal Pay Act basically just says men and women performing equal work must receive equal pay. Any employer that has to meet the minimum wage requirement also is subject to this requirement. And you can have a wage differential, like you've got two people doing the same job, getting paid a different amount. If it's based on seniority or a merit system, meaning one of them is doing it better than the other one, rather, or any factor other than sex. One's a man, one's a woman, and that's why they're getting paid differently. And if a company is found to be having differential pay, paying people different that are doing the same job because their genders are different, then instead of lowering the higher paid person to the lower rate, you have to raise the lower rate to the higher rate. Okay, child labor. This is a big deal in other countries, but They don't have the strict laws that we do. If you're in a non-farm occupation, if you have employees 16 to 17, they can work an unlimited number of hours each week in non-hazardous jobs. 14 and 15-year-olds are limited to employment in retail and food, or gas, like a service station. And they have very specific conditions as to hours and employment conditions. Now, if it's in an agricultural occupation, the rules are changed. Generally, if they're, if they're under 12, they can't be working for you. Now, we're not talking family businesses here. You know, like people, 12-year-olds or less doing their chores. But this is, hiring kids under 12. Children between ages 10 and 11 can work as hand harvest laborers outside school hours, but only between June 1st and October 15th. That's, the main growing and harvesting season. And there's a lot of strict limitations on this. And the employer needs to have a certificate of age on file, or else they could be in big trouble, because they will get fined serious fines. So what the FSLA does not cover: employees aren't required to pay extra for weekend or holiday work, pay for holidays, vacation, or severance. They don't have to limit the number of work hours for people 16 years or older. They don't have to give holidays, vacation, or sick time, sick leave. This might seem unfair, but employers don't have to do this.